All right, guys, welcome back to the third episode. Got a very special guest today, Luke Eckerle. He is pretty private on social media, but for those of you that are in the know, this is Joe Borenstein's coach. Joe is currently the best lifter by points in the IPF, so should be a very interesting episode. So, Luke, just to start off, I know you are pretty young, and Joe's obviously pretty young as well. Can you just tell everyone, like, around what age you were and what age he was when you started coaching him?
Yeah, so currently right now I'm 22. Joey's also 22, but when I started coaching him, I just turned 18. So it would have been, actually it was just before my birthday, just before my 18th birthday. So I would have been like 17, about to turn 18. It was February in 2021. So I've been coaching for about 4.25 years now. So
You've got like the GOAT coaching resume, just about. If we're only looking at points and one lifter, you got the GOAT coaching resume by 22. So that's pretty impressive.
Yep.
And roughly, I don't expect you to know exactly, but roughly what were his numbers when you were starting out?
So he actually had just done a mock meet. I want to say his squat was, I think he hit 500, like RP 11. And then he benched 337 and then deadlifted. I think he failed 622 off of a like faulty hook grip, I want to say.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's like 550 pounds in the total or something like that, and you only up one weight class, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so yeah, that's pretty insane. Whenever you started coaching him, how quick did you notice that he was a very special talent? Was it like first month you were like, this kid's insane, now he's got a little more structure, better program? Or was it like maybe it took a while and you had to get some experience under your belt as a coach?
Honestly, I knew he was going to be special, like right when I started coaching him, just because going back like 4.5 years ago, I was trying to get the national record as a 74 kilo lifter, and I saw Joey broke the record I was trying to get by about 30 kilos. I think the record was around 610 to 615 kilo, and he hit like 640. So right then and there, I knew like this guy was on another level when it came to training. However, when I came across his training on Instagram and things like that, there was no structure. So he was just doing this all basically like natural strength, all his background. And so there was no like progression or anything like that. So yeah, that's honestly when I knew he'd be special. And I kind of wanted to help him out a little bit because I felt like I had a little bit better structure with my training, and I had a little bit more experience with how to build a program. So I just kind of like gave it a shot in the dark and was like, dude, just let me experiment a little bit with your training and see where it goes. And it's led us here. So
Yeah, that's a great story. You were like, all right, I'm not going to power lift long term, I guess. I'm putting all my chips in the Joe basket. Although I like totally was like around the same age at the time, and I saw like your Instagram and you used to post lifts, and you were pretty darn strong too. At one point,
yeah.
weren't you squatting like around 7 or something?
Yeah. So my PRs, I squatted 715, benched 420, and then deadlifted like 665. It was kind of like soft lockout, but yeah, squat was definitely my lift. So
So you probably had Joe on the total for a while. So like in theory, if you were still keeping up with it, man, like you'd probably be the number one lifter, but like Joe can take the spotlight. Will you go do like brain surgery and stuff, right?
yeah, the one thing we don't want to talk about though is that I was like 30 kilos heavier than Joey at the time. So
No
I
weight classes in the jungle, man.
yeah, that's right.
With that being said, though, at that point, you saw he was making some pretty fast progress, and he put probably what 400 pounds on his total ish in the same weight class, which is obviously extremely remarkable. Did you find that like in the first year, like you made those programming adjustments and going from just like the natural strength in the gym, maxing out all the time, that made a huge difference, it sounds like? Or was it kind of like you as a coach really had to refine your skills? Maybe it was a little bit better than what he was already doing, but like it also took a lot more effort on your end? Or was it just like he got a little structure and just the rest is history?
I would say initially it was kind of like what you ended with. Like once we add a little bit of linear periodization, and just like RPE based work, his programming took off. Like his strength, we went from like 640 kilo to 675 in our first meet together to 700. And then he just kept like doing meets and he kept PRing at least 15 to 25 kilos. And so that was like initially his strength really took off. And then towards the Arnold of 2023, so we'll backtrack a little bit before that. He did a meet at the end of 2022, I want to say, and he hit 780 kilo at 74. And so this was kind of like the end of his beginner gains, you could say, as well as like the beginner gains for me as a coach, because then we prepped for the Arnold in 2023, and that didn't really go very well. We actually backtracked. That was the only meet that we backtracked kilos on the total. He totaled like 767 and a half. And so that was kind of like the turning point where I was like, okay, I need to become a little bit better as a coach. I need to be a little bit more, invested. I need to do a lot more analysis. And then after that point, he did Raw Nationals, and he hit, I think like 6 months later, he hit 800.5. And then he did the Arnold like 6 months after that. He did like 820 with an injured back. And then, and then now we're here. He obviously bombed out of junior nationals, but we don't talk about that. But then, he did Raleigh. We jumped up a weight class, did 865 and then 900. So I would say like, towards the end of 2022, about 2 years in, the progression kind of slowed down, and, it really put it on me in order to become better as a coach. So yeah, a little bit of both.
Yeah, that noob gains in the coaching and athlete department is crazy. I'm sure the programming is good, and Joe clearly works crazy hard, but just casually like the third best 74 total at the time is crazy. And then you got the programming and everything better clearly. Was his best total like 820, and he was maybe injured for that meet at 74?
Yeah, his best total was the Arnold 2024 820 with an injured back. We were looking at 840, but the deadlift just with squats before, and we had like a injury 2 weeks out, I remember, for that meet. So we really didn't want to push the deadlift. But yeah, we still ended with 820, and it was a great day. So
yeah, you guys clearly also, I want to mention, have like some of the most dialed in programming at this point. I mean, you have to. He's an athlete that PRs so consistently. His training performance, his meet performance, just everything is always dialed. So I know he's crazy genetically and everything, but clearly on your part, like, I feel like you've got to play a massive, massive role. And I'm sure he'd be strong with any coach. But like, even if you look at other high-level coaches, their athletes do not hit PRs as consistently as you guys, put up as good of meet performance as you guys and everything. So really props for that. But would you mind taking us through like just how the strategies have changed over time, maybe lift by lift? If I think I remember you making a post on deadlift before like one of his meets, saying like when your post was maybe it was on your account when you actually had an account up, or maybe it was on Joe's, saying you like dropped his deadlift volume and he hit a really big surge. Could you talk about experiences like that, just breakthroughs with the program that you had?
yeah, absolutely. I would say like one of the big changes that we made was just I started to be a little bit more of a statistician, you could say. I started to really record all types of variables, like all the weekly volume, the absolute intensity needed in order to, express true top end strength on the week 4, as well as, frequency. I just basically recorded a lot of stats, and I also took into account a lot of historical trends with regards to programming. We did a ton of experimentation, and I would just I would fine tune changes from block to block. And that was kind of like the biggest thing. But yeah, some like blips in the training that led us to where we are now. One of the things with his bench, a good example would be, I thought that like recovery was a main issue on his primary bench day. And so I thought that front loading volume earlier in the week away from his primary SPD would help drop that fatigue towards the end of the week when, his primary SPD was scheduled to happen and his like main bench day was. However, he actually ended up regressing and getting weaker because of this. And so that kind of let me know that it wasn't fatigue management that was the issue. It was more so he was having trouble with like bench priming, and just like maintaining that high intensity. We were dropping intensity way too early in the week. And then once we got to that primary SPD, like all the weight felt heavy in his hands, even though he did feel very recovered. So that led me to, stack the bench days closer to the primary day, as well as also increase the relative intensity that he was touching on like the day 3 bench, you could say, which was like 3 days before his primary SBD. And that led to like basically just him instantly gaining, 5, maybe 7.5 kilos in the top end bench strength. So that was definitely huge. And we kind of saw that going into Raleigh, but more so this past meet at Nats. One of the key things that we learned from the Nats prep was that the quaternary day was actually too low in intensity. So we had it at we had the quaternary day at about like 73 to 75% absolute intensity, and we raised it to about 80%. So we went from about like 345 on the quaternary day to about 375. And this basically blew up his bench at Nats. We went through a weight cut. He went through a 6-hour drive, and his bench had never been stronger than it was this past PLA Nats. So that was definitely something on bench. For squat. Definitely switching out the intensity for more volume work on the secondary. That led to, a lot of strength gains because with Joey's squat, we like to keep the intensity very low on the secondary. We like to have more high rep back down work on the secondary day, just because the squat does fatigue very rapidly if you do have high intensity on that secondary day. So we found that was kind of like another, instant strength boost that we had. And then for the deadlift, we kind of structured our variations a little bit smarter. And so what I mean by that was going into the Arnold, the reason why he was having trouble with his back was because he had too much flexion in his back on deadlifts. And so this was because of all the conventional and all of the pause rep work that we were doing. And so a simple fix for that was just to implement, beltless deadlifts, which kind of helped him gain that back extension again. And that kind of helped fix his deadlift technique. So now we have it where we do conventional is really good for building overall strength. However, it does contribute to a lot of back flexion, which does kind of predispose Joey to undergoing injuries and stuff. So then we immediately transition to beltless deadlifts, which then reinstigates that back extension. But then that kind of like causes Joey to be a little bit weaker off the floor and lose positioning towards the top. And so then we implement pause deadlifts in order to kind of, solve all the problems and get a little bit more specific going into meet day. So yeah, those are like, I guess, 3 very random, but also very specific examples of like things that I look for that kind of improve Joey's training.
Yeah, that was super detailed. I love it. And you said he benches how many times a week?
He benches 4 times a week.
Okay. Would you mind breaking down why you guys settled on 4? I know around the 83 class, it's pretty common to do anything from like 3 times a week to 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we originally, when I started working with him, we did 3 times a week bench, and that worked well initially. However, his bench did kind of, stall a little bit. So then I added a 4th day, but I dropped volume on every day. So I basically kept volume the same, but then had 4 bench days instead of 3. And this kind of like helped him acclimate to the 4 days a week. And then when I started adding more volume, he really started to take off with his bench strength. But then I wanted him to kind of, reset after a meet. I believe it was the Arnold. After Arnold in 2023, we were doing 4 times a week, and I wanted him to pull back a little bit because we had been pushing bench really hard. And I brought him back to 3 times a week, and his bench strength went like so low, like his top end was absolutely terrible. So I knew right then and there that we had to keep 4 times a week benching in order to gain any progression on the bench. And then, over the years, I've just kept it at 4 just because of this. I feel like we have enough frequency to where we can hit all of the volume we need with 4 bench days. And I really feel like 5 is kind of excessive, but really just like manipulating the intensity and the volume work with the 4 days bench. It's definitely like all that Joey needs to progress right now. Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, especially as such a long range of motion, pretty flat back, such a strong bencher too. That makes a lot of sense. He'd be maybe moderate or slightly lower almost on the frequency side of bench compared to other 83s like Sean Noriega or someone?
Yeah. Yep. We actually, so I have been increasing the frequency a lot recently, and I've been lowering the reps each day, and that's actually paid off tremendously with his bench. Joey, as you guys have seen on Instagram, he loves the heavy intensity and high exposure for his bench. He posts like a new bench PR every week, but yeah, every day is pretty intense for Joey. So, but I feel like if I were to add another bench day, I feel like it would be a little bit too intense. And just, yeah, it would draw back from a lot of his recovery.
Yeah. So you said you dropped the sets a little bit and are pushing them more intensely?
So actually, I increased the number of sets, dropped the reps per set.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yes. Yep.
So mainly just a relative intensity thing, not an or excuse me, a absolute intensity, not a relative intensity.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely increasing the absolute intensity. But yeah, I think we started, so in the beginning of Nats prep, we started about 13 sets per week on bench. And then at the last block, we deloaded with 18 sets, and we in the week 4 we had 21 sets. So definitely increased the amount of frequency per week on bench, but we kept volume roughly the same. And so yeah, we had to decrease the amount of reps, but that definitely, like with that higher specificity and higher absolute intensity, like you were mentioning, that really paid off with his bench with those lower reps.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for the insight. I love like you are so specific and dialed with this stuff, with which is what I expected, but like I think most of the people are gonna love it because they just haven't heard you talk much
Yeah.
about this stuff
Yeah.
before, even the podcasts that you have been on. So this is super great for all the listeners. But going back to, you said he was doing bench 3 times a week, went up to 4, saw some progress, and then eventually you pulled back to 3. Didn't go so well. Is just that overall increase of workload, whether it's, you know, maybe it's not frequency on other lifts, maybe it's volume or intensity. Does that seem to be a thing that if he does plateau, is that kind of your first go-to and it helps? Or is that really just a bench thing and it hasn't been a trend on squat and deadlift?
Funny you mentioned that. I would say it's probably just a bench thing. We actually keep squat and deadlift volume relatively low compared to other lifters. When I did increase squat volume tremendously, going into the Arnold in 2023, his squat didn't really progress much. And then I took a totally different approach. I decreased volume and decreased specificity tremendously. I think the only comp set he was doing going into Raw Nats was his top set on the primary SBD. So we just completely switched sides in terms of programming. We went all variation work, very low volume. And he went from failing, I want to say he failed like mid 500s at the Arnold, and then 6 months later he hit 600 at Nationals. So that definitely worked out. And so I would say, yeah, it's definitely just a bench thing. Because with squat, you know, I tried one extreme and then I tried the other, and actually the lower end of the volume was actually better. And then similarly with deadlift, like you mentioned this earlier, we did drop deadlift volume quite a bit leading into what was it, Raleigh, and he hit a bench PR he hit a deadlift PR for the first time in I think it was like a year and 8 months. I think his last deadlift PR before Raleigh was like in the December 2022 meet. But anyways, yeah, definitely. I think squat and deadlift actually prefer having the lower volume and intensity, and then bench was the exact opposite. So we pushed intensity as well as volume, and it paid off tremendously.
Okay, that's really interesting to note. I've seen that trend with, I'm sure you know, like Aiden Rader potentially.
Yes, yeah.
He said the same thing. I've always heard him talk about like his lower body seems to get just unbelievably fatigued, even with minimal work. And then his upper body can just eat everything up, push all his accessories super hard. But I don't know how common that is for the average athlete, but clearly it's there at the disparity in upper and lower recovery. It's for sure there to some extent. So you guys are pretty known for taking like pretty big jumps, obviously, because Joe week to week posts like week 1 total, week 2 total. So people see the top sets and how he's building up. Is that a thing that you guys have done more recently in the past like year? Is that always in your programming? And if it wasn't, can you just talk a little bit about like why you've done that and why you think it's beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, like with regards to the jumps, we've kind of tested, jumping different amounts from week to week, ever since we started working together, and we jump differently depending on what training day is at stake. So for instance, like we found for the secondary tertiary bench days, we need the jumps to be a lot less, just because he definitely needs a lot more priming for the primary SBD day. And so we need to keep that day relatively heavy compared to the primary SBD where he does his primary bench. But yeah, trying to think. Yeah, I would say like Joey definitely fatigues very rapidly when it comes to something like a deadlift. So I believe we jump about 25% from week 1 to 4 with the deadlift. So, and it's just because Joey fatigues very rapidly on deadlift. That's just something we found. Yeah, we've always kind of just done it. What we kind of do is we plan out what number we want to hit, and then we basically backtrack from that number in increments from the jumps that we know are what we are accustomed to and what have worked in the past. And then, we basically just work our way up to that goal number. And, more often than not, we do hit the number. But yeah, definitely the bigger jumps from week to week are what is better for Joey, just because of the fact that he does fatigue a lot under heavier intensity.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you guys just figured that out through like trial and error over years of coaching him.
Absolutely. Yep.
So he recently just went up from the 74s to 83s in like around the last year-ish. I think it's been like a year and 2 months, something like that. And he's seen a ton of progress. Obviously, most lifters that go up a weight class are going to see some progress. Maybe not as much as Joe. Maybe he was pretty darn lean at that point. He's filled out 83 much better. So that's pretty normal to some extent, but not to the extent that we've really seen it with Joe. Is there any reason behind that? Do you think like he really was able to recover better with the extra food, or maybe like you changed his training approach and he's just stronger now and you had to pull back? What have you noticed with his training?
His training, I think that the weight increase has definitely led to us having to do less work on squat and deadlift, kind of with the trend that I was mentioning earlier. And then also with the bench press, like adding the volume, I think that his ROM got a lot smaller from 74 to 83, and his arch got a little bit better. And I think that led us to have that like higher frequency, kind of like what you mentioned with Sean Noriega. Having that less like lower range of motion really helped with the programming, with the higher frequency, and then the lower rep ranges. Yeah, that's kind of, I would say, yeah, definitely lower overall work on the squat and deadlift. That's kind of what we've seen. It is kind of weird. You would think that like with the added calories, you would be able to handle more work. However, as you do get heavier as a lifter, we do see that they can actually handle less work, and less work is actually more beneficial, especially for the squat and deadlift. So that was kind of a trend that I saw with Joey as well. But yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, I've noticed that on bench with myself. A couple of years ago, I weighed like 60 pounds less, and it was so pronounced. Like I used to touch my sternum on bench, and I was like, oh, I can touch my stomach like 2 inches higher. Sweet. And now I'm losing weight again, and I have to go back to touching my sternum, and it just feels absolutely horrible now. So maybe I gotta go back up like Joe.
Yeah.
Um,
You do have a very insane bench, by the way. I was taking a look.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Props. Yeah.
Appreciate that. A few blocks before nationals, I think it was like 3 or 4 blocks away, you guys were doing a higher volume period. You pulled back on the top sets, although I think he actually went ahead and hit like the 900 kilos. So it went really well anyway with the top end strength, but you were pushing the back offs a little bit more. Can you talk about like why you decided to do that? If you think it was something that was productive, if you'll do it again, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started to notice that Joey's work capacity started to kind of tank. And he was getting a lot more fatigued because of him lacking a good work capacity. So I definitely wanted to push the back down work because that kind of put a cap on how much absolute intensity we were touching. The plan was to push the back down work and then kind of pull back on the top sets, as Joey did mention in his comments section. However, that's actually not what happened. Joey still got stronger. But that's just Joey. But anyways, yeah, we were just pushing, like we were coming off a very high intensity period. We had done, or this was not advised, but Joey did do an 885 on a deload week. And so that definitely contributed to a lot of added fatigue. And so I really wanted to put a cap on how much absolute intensity he was touching on his top sets. But with that being said, I did want to increase his work capacity tremendously going into the final weeks of the block, just so he could handle the higher intensity lows that we were going to touch with ease towards the end of meet prep.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And with meet prep in mind, you guys, I mentioned earlier, you guys really always just peak perfectly. Like in all your last meets, he did get injured at like junior nationals, but obviously that I'm assuming had nothing to do with his peak. That was just like some squat depth issue, right?
Yes, absolutely. His range of motion, he just was not used to going that low. So
Yeah, that makes sense. That's understandable. But luckily, he bounced back quick, and ever since, you guys have still continued to peak perfect. Like if you look at his training, you can always look and be like, "Yep, he hit this in prep. He's probably good for a little bit more on each lift, strongest on meet day." And that's something that the average powerlifter, that's probably like their biggest weakness, just making sure their strength shows up on meet day. So could you maybe give some insight onto why you think you're so good at that with Joe, and what the average lifter can do better?
yeah, absolutely. So Joe and I's peaking strategy, it's changed a little bit over the years. But one of the main things that we've done or that we've changed is that we actually train into the meet more often than not now. And what that kind of means is we just do a regular block. So we do weeks 1 through 4, and then we basically taper all of the accessories, all the secondary, tertiary, quaternary days after the week 4 SBD. And then we go into the week 5, just like it would be a primary SBD the following week. And I feel like this is a much more reliable way of tapering. As you mentioned, Joey consistently hits what he hits in the gym on the platform. And I really attribute it to our peaking strategy. We do the same thing every time, like you said. But yeah, we basically just build up week 1 through 4. But we give ourselves an extra week. Normally we have, 4-week block. We build up RP 6 through 9 roughly. However, with the block going into the meet, we start an RP lower, and then we end off of that week 4 around RP 8. And then we obviously taper off our accessory work and all of our other secondary work. And then we go into the meet feeling very fresh every single time. And we know exactly how we're going to feel. It's kind of like priming your body. Like you get all of this fatigue. And then we maintain our intensity on the secondary day, which is something that I don't know if many people do. All we do is drop volume, but we maintain all of our intensity or add intensity on the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary day after that week 4 going into the meet. So I guess that might be something that we do differently. But yeah, I definitely prefer this way over like a fast taper, just like a traditional taper, just because it is way more reliable. And yeah, like you said, like exactly what you're going to hit because the prior week, based on how that felt, with a little bit more recovery, a little bit less fatigue, you'll be good for this. And yeah, definitely it works out.
Yeah, I actually talked to Marcellus yesterday, which that podcast should be up a couple days before this one. And he said pretty much the exact same thing. So you guys are both thinking the same thing. I also think he said Steve DeNovi does it just like that as well. So this must be like clearly the move. So people listening at home, listen to Marcellus and Luke talk about this, and Steve, because clearly if your peak isn't going well, you just got to find a way to be strong in training. If you're strong in training, maybe just taper the accessories just a bit, like you guys are both saying. You should be strong in the meet. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're strong in training hitting PRs, why would you mix it up too much,
Absolutely. And then also, I guess one more thing I would like to add is we do like an 8-day taper week. It's kind of like a paradox, but yeah, so what we do is we structure our SBD day the day before meet day in the week. So like if Joey were competing on a Wednesday, we'd have the primary SBD day on a Tuesday. And so then what we do is we basically have an extra day of recovery that we can play with. And this kind of helps just with overall recovery, but then it also helps balance the additional stress and like the hassle with the extra travel as well as with the weight cut. So it helps, keep recovery on point even with these additional variables that we do have to control for going into a meet.
Okay, that's super interesting and unique. I actually think I remember hearing maybe Joe say he used to bench like every other day instead of 4 times a week. Is that something that I'm remembering correctly, or you guys still do?
Yeah, that's basically what that's basically why we do the 8-day taper. It's just so that Joe can bench every other day going into the meet. Because with the added stress by benching 4 days a week, it does help Joey's recovery if he does space out his bench days a little bit more with the 8-day peak week. But yeah, because we do front load we do back load Joey's intensity on his bench, so it definitely helps with recovery going into the meet for bench specifically.
Okay, yeah, I gotcha. And so that's just a thing when you're peaking.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. That lines up nicely for a meet with that extra day and the every other day variable. How do you expect Joe to feel if he's going from weeks 1, 2, 3, 4? Like, is it kind of a thing where I know you're doing the 4-week blocks, like he comes in week 1, he feels pretty beat up, or maybe like some coaches, their athletes are pretty beat up in week 1 and 2, 3 and 4, they're feeling good. Some coaches say the athletes aren't very primed. Maybe in weeks 2, they start to feel a little bit detrained, so they're pushing the intensities higher. How do you expect Joe to feel going through the weeks?
Yeah. So Joey normally feels really beat up on week 1, like you mentioned. But then week 2, he does feel a little bit better, especially on squat and deadlift, because it's kind of like when we were doing the 2-week taper, this is basically what like you do with the 2-week taper is you hit your heavy load on a week 4, and then week 1 is kind of like the deload. The only thing we do differently is that on like after the week 1, we wouldn't push intensity. But he definitely, it's kind of like the week 2 rebound. He feels a very big surge in strength on the week 2. So we kind of plan for that, and that's pretty expected. And then on week 3, he kind of feels a little bit worse than week 2, just because this, I guess, like peak feeling goes away with the 2-week taper. But then, week 4 comes around with the added intensity from the week 3. The week 4 ends up feeling really well, and then we see the same jump from week 4 to meet day. So, for instance, on Joey's squat, he has to touch like over 5 reds in order for him to unlock his true peak strength 2 weeks later. So, for instance, he's hit like 606 before this past Raw Nationals on the week 3, so that was 2 weeks out, and he hit that roughly at RP 8. We expected it to move pretty bad, and it did relative to what we knew we were capable of. And then we ended up progressing to 644 on week 4, and it actually moved very similarly to the 606. You could argue it's probably 0.5 RPE higher, but with the jump that we made, we knew we had gotten tremendously stronger from the week 3 to week 4. We had unlocked those intensity adaptations that we need in order to truly unlock that top end strength. And then, from the week 4 to week 5, we knew that 644 would move a little bit less than a second attempt on meet day if it moved at like an RP 8 on the week prior. And so that's basically what happened. You saw Joey hit 650 at PLA Nats second attempt, and it moved better than it did week 4. And it was obviously heavier, 650 versus 644. And and then we knew we were good for like our top end of 305 to 307 and a half.
I've noticed that a lot in his training, especially on his squat, like you're saying. We might have a week there where the RP is looking pretty rough, and then the next week he just adds like 10, 15 kilos, whatever it is, moves just as well. So that adds a lot of context for that and what makes him feel good. You're just dropping like a ton of great info. Is there somewhere that you like learned all this? Has it really just been like you and Joey doing a case study? Has it been like you're learning this from other coaches? Maybe that happened when you're younger. Now you're just experimenting on him just on your own.
Yeah, I definitely, when we were going through that rough patch in training, like about a year and a half to 2 years ago after the Arnold, I definitely had to do a big deep dive into, what makes a good coach, how do they truly analyze and adapt their programming for future directions. And so I definitely, I've did a lot of YouTube analysis. I did a lot of research on powerlifting now. So shout out, Marcellus, Sean, Steve, and Brad. Schoolyard. That is an amazing app that you can kind of download, and they basically go through every single coaching topic imaginable. And I basically watched pretty much all of those videos like 2 years ago, and I've continued to this day. I'm a proud subscriber. But anyways, that was definitely a big coaching resource that I used. And then also just other YouTube channels, like their individual YouTube channels, like Sean Noriega's, Steve DeNovi, Marcellus, they hold a lot of great information. And I also did a lot of like research with how they program. So Steve posted like how he programmed his beginner, intermediate, advanced 15-week beginner program or whatever. I think that dropped like right when I started coaching. So I definitely watched that a lot through my earlier years of coaching. Yeah, it was just a lot of like YouTube video analysis and then also powerlifting now. And that's just how I've shaped my training. It's funny that you say that like Marcellus, and Steve basically said the same thing about the taper. I basically, I drafted that from them and then also just from customization with Joey.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm a proud subscriber as well to powerlifting now. It's definitely really solid. It's super cheap too. Like if anyone's interested in coaching themselves or anyone else, I don't know why you wouldn't have that. It's so cheap. There's so much knowledge out there all the time. And they have their Instagram too, and they always post those reels, and you see it and you're like, if you're not subscribed, like you got to subscribe. You got to see the rest of the like 60-minute breakdown. I was actually going to have Marcellus on, and we were going to talk about Sean's whole like the changes that made him make so much progress. And then like 2 days before the podcast, he dropped that on powerlifting now, and he was just in so much detail. I watched it. I had no follow-up questions, and I was like, he answered everything perfectly. He showed the programs, like he added so much value. We gotta change up topics entirely because I got nothing to go off of now.
Gotcha. That's hilarious. Yeah, it is definitely a super good resource. And I will add to anybody watching, if you want to become a better powerlifter, you yourself have to have a lot of knowledge and experience with regards to programming. I think what makes Joey a great lifter is that he also is a good coach, and he knows what he wants from his lifters, and then he can give that information very easily to me. And so then that makes my job a lot easier. So he's a very good communicator, and he also has a lot of hands-on experience with programming. So I would say as an athlete, if you know what direction your programming is going, then you will feel more confident as a lifter, and you'll have better training because of it. So I would say definitely try and embrace yourself into the sport and learn as much information as you can with your programming so that you can help your coach out, because you yourself are the only one who truly knows how you feel and like how much information you can actually give to your coach. So yeah.
Yeah, you could be the best coach in the world, but if you're getting really bad feedback from your athlete, and obviously if they're not adhering to what you're actually saying, it's not really going to do anything. So I could see how that helps a lot. And also, you guys' situation is very unique, where I know you've got a big workload with, are you in medical school at the moment?
So I actually just graduated from undergrad last week. And so, yeah, I'm matriculating this fall.
Okay, congrats. But that helps you put a lot of focus on him in particular as an athlete, because I believe you only have a handful of athletes, him and a couple of your friends from like the King of the Lifts podcast. I think you said that. I'm sure you got people DMing you, and probably will after this podcast, unfortunately for you, if you don't want to take on people. But that lets you put a lot of focus into him. Do you think that's also been maybe a strength, besides just you're able to dedicate a ton of time to his program in particular and your relationship with him? But do you also think there's an aspect to, there have been some bad trends in powerlifting? Maybe, I don't want to name specific ones and call people out or anything, but in the past 5 years, people try a certain fad, just like in any fitness, and then after a year or two, maybe it swings in the opposite direction. Do you think kind of staying out of the coaching powerlifting scene a little bit more than most coaches has helped you, or do you think it's hurt you because maybe you can stay more objective, or maybe you just only have this one experiment on Joe, or maybe a couple other friends, and if you coached more athletes, maybe you would have developed faster as a coach? Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it definitely helps out just from a focus standpoint, and also from a standpoint that it doesn't like skew how I program Joey. I would say like by just programming Joey, I noticed when I did have more athletes, I've had like a total of 4 athletes, and I noticed that whatever I programmed Joe, I almost all like instinctively tried to program my other athletes. It was weird. But I tried to like stay away from that, but it was just like, the format of the programming started to like instinctively drift towards, my other athletes training. So I would say like, and then also vice versa, when I would try and like do something well for an athlete, I tried to implement it with Joey instinctively. And as I've gotten away from that, I only coach 2 people now. Joey is one of them. And, as I've totally separated Joey's training from all my other athletes, I do feel that like that higher focus on Joey has really helped me be a more objective coach solely for Joey. And I do think that a lot of coaches do struggle with repeating the same program over and over again for each of their athletes because it is tough. I will say, like, once you get in your specific coaching ways, it is hard to kind of think outside the box on certain issues that you might be having. But like just focusing on Joey, it definitely allows me to really hone in specifically on him and really, give him what he needs in order to progress. So I would say it's definitely an overall plus.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. I've got this like thing that I say that's like coaching. Obviously, you need to understand the fundamentals, but after a certain point, you can always look at other coaches, powerlifting now, that sort of thing. But on an individual athlete level, if you just understand the basics really, really well, and then just use some pattern recognition, you don't make too crazy a changes at a time, like you will get your athlete results, even if some athlete varies wildly from the other. So I'm glad to hear that seems to be like what's worked with you and Joey as well.
Absolutely.
This next question is kind of a shot in the dark. So if you just have no answer for this at all, that is totally fine. But is there anything that you plan on, like, his training always goes very well. So like if this is a no, that's fine, like I said. But like, is there anything you guys are wanting to test again in the future? Maybe you're planning on running back those volume blocks again. Maybe you want to try something else. Maybe you think there's even better gains to be had on his squat, bench, or deadlift if you change whatever variable. Is there anything you're looking at right now? Or is it just kind of smooth sailing and you want to keep the plan the same?
So I would say we'll start off with bench. I would say we do have the plan very well figured out. However, the extent of the high intensity that Joey's bench needs to express his true strength on the primary day still kind of like lingers out there. I feel like if we were to, I'm going to like definitely in the off season, I'm going to experiment with increasing intensity even more later in the week and see at what point like the higher intensity actually draws back from Joey's top end strength on his primary bench day. So that's definitely something we want to test is just even higher intensity. But we have kept bench specificity relatively the same just because we've had like, back to back meets with Nats, Worlds, and then also Sheffield, hopefully coming up. But anyways, so yeah, we've basically kept like it's super specific in his training. So I definitely want to try getting away from that specificity a little bit, getting more back towards variation work, and see if that has any, strength gains hidden for him. In terms of squat, there's nothing really different that I would want to do. I would say kind of similarly with bench, get back into the variation mindset. Joey, I would say like Joey favors doing a lot of like non-specific work, especially on a secondary day, like I was mentioning, like leading up into nationals. We basically only made his top set primary squat set the only comp set during the week. And so I definitely want to get more back to that variation work for squat as well. And then deadlift, I want to push conventional a lot more. That is definitely something that I want to do just because we haven't really had like that deep of an off season in a long time. And conventional is something that we need to do very far out from a meet just because it's not very specific, but it does build overall strength very well for Joey specifically. So I would say, yeah, definitely getting back towards more conventional secondary day for deadlifts.
Yeah, it was fun to see him push that conventional in the past. He would always hit like the heaviest conventional set and then somehow go into his primary and still hit a crazy sumo set. I personally could absolutely not recover from that. I always thought that was just nuts. Do you typically push his, like whenever you do the beltless and the beltless pause, do you push the RPs as hard on that? Or is that more just a conventional building muscle mass type of thing?
Normally we don't. We try not to push those days. However, at that point in the off season, I believe that was like blocks 1 and 2 of last off season, we did the conventional. So at that point in time, we were doing lots of high rep work on the primary. So we didn't really have that high of absolute intensity on the primary. So that's why we kind of pushed the secondary day a little bit more. But, other than that, we don't really try and push the secondary day too much leading up into a meet specifically. That's just kind of like a very far out off-season thing. However, when he did push that conventional, 2 blocks later, he hit the 885 on the deload week. So that's kind of like my suspicion with the conventional being very good for his overall strength. However, it just needs to be a little bit farther out from when he needs to truly express that top end.
Yeah, sounds like it potentiates that future block or two really well. I
Absolutely.
asked, as the last question yesterday, I was asking just athlete advice, but I'd like to swap it for you. What's the biggest, maybe 1, 2, 3 pieces of advice, whatever you got in the chamber, just pieces of advice you'd give to coaches on how to successfully coach their athletes? Maybe it's mistakes you see people make or just things that have helped you.
Yeah, let me think about this.
You can think all you need.
Yeah. I would say like one thing is to just really try not to get too stuck in your own ways. Kind of like I was mentioning before, like every athlete is different. And if you truly want to be a high level coach, I guess you probably, like most high level coaches, have a big roster. So you definitely cannot let one athlete's, programming seep in and affect another athlete. So I would say one is to definitely just really try and think outside the box and keep every athlete in your brain separate, just because every athlete is individual and that's what they pay you for is individualized coaching. And that's one thing that I really don't have to deal with as a coach because I only coach Joey. So I guess I'm very thankful for that. But I would say definitely don't get too stuck in your own ways. Another thing I would say, just really, you got to have insane communication. I think that like what makes Joey and I so special is that we talk on a day-to-day basis. And I know it's probably pretty troublesome if you have like 30 or 40 athletes, but just trying to give as much communication as possible and trying to get as much feedback from your athletes as possible is so huge when it comes to informing future decisions with your programming. And even like just talking to athletes about like normal stuff, being more humane with athletes, it really helps you, I guess, just build that relationship better with your athletes so they feel more comfortable in expressing their true feelings about their programming with you. And then, I don't know, another one. I mean, I would just become better at recognizing patterns, like you were saying, I guess. Just really try and, I would say, let like the information in front of you talk to you. Don't try and like force anything. I would say like just let the data present itself and try out new things. And then whatever works, like just go back and see what works specifically in terms of like exact data and statistics points, and then let that inform your future decisions. Yeah, that's basically all I got.
No, that was all really great advice. I think the people are going to like hearing that. And typically at this part in the podcast, I would say link your coaching, tell me about your socials, but you have a private account and you also don't want to take on more athletes at the moment, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. But I will ask as a hypothetical, if like Bob Matthews, Austin Perkins, someone was like, man, this guy seems like a great coach after this podcast. I don't want to work with my current coach. Would you take them on?
Probably not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, Phil Jackson only had one MJ, so I guess I gotta just stay true to my guy, Joe. But yeah, I really don't have time for it, to be honest, on a more
Okay.
serious note.
Yeah.
I'd love to, but just being completely honest, I just can't. So
Yeah, no, that's very humble of you and knowing your own abilities and everything too, with just your time constraints. I will say I'm kind of surprised by that answer though. I thought you'd be like, if you got top 10 dots in the world, I'll coach you, no one else. But Michael Jordan thing that's pretty cool too. It makes for like the coolest coaching athlete combo in powerlifting easily. Like I don't think anyone really has that crazy of a coaching story that you guys started so young, and also like he's pretty much your only athlete besides one of your friends. So that's really cool. But with that being said, I really appreciate you coming on. I think the podcast went really well. I think people like it a lot. If
absolutely.
you got any final words, go for it. If not, appreciate you guys watching.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have really many final words. I would just say I'd like to say thank you for having me on. I mentioned this before, but it is my first podcast without Joe. It's kind of like the first deep dive on Joey's programming and analysis. So I hope that you guys can gain something from this. I will say I'm Joe Borenstein's coach. I'm not your coach. So please take this information with a grain of salt. Do not go into detail and implement everything that I do for Joey, because it might work for you, but it also very well might not. However, I do hope that you guys can utilize all the analysis that I do and have set forth for you guys today, and implement that with your coach and just kind of learn how Joey and I do things. And then you can implement that way of doing things in your own training. And then lastly, just looking forward to Worlds, and hopefully getting a Sheffield invite after securing a world championship. So thank you guys for tuning in.
And last question, I guess, quick one. Are you going to Worlds?
Yes, I'll be there.
Okay, and Sheffield too, I would assume. I'm guessing Joey's going to make it, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't want to say anything, but just be expecting a show at World. So,
Awesome. Love it. Thank you, man.
no problem. Take care.